There's a good chance you're looking at this renderless tag input component and thinking to yourself, okay, that's cool, I appreciate the flexibility, but man, that sure looks like a lot of work and a lot of code to have to implement myself every time I just want a simple tag input. And I would agree with you. Look at how much simpler it was originally. We just had one tag, a tag input tag, we passed through some vModel stuff, and we were done. And that rendered this down here, which works exactly the same way as this one. But in this case, we had to do all this work of writing all of the markup ourselves, destructuring all this stuff out of the slot scope, binding everything up. It definitely is a lot more work to do all of this every time you need a tag input than it is to just do something like this. Thankfully, we can have our cake and eat it too by creating opinionated wrapper components. I'll show you what I mean. Let's head over to our components directory here. I'm going to create a new component called inline tag input.view. Let's scaffold out a new view component here and get this thing working. So the way it's going to work is we're going to take all of this code that we wrote here with this renderless tag input, and we're going to paste that into the template of the inline tag input. We'll go ahead and make sure that we import the renderless tag input in this component because it's going to be built using that component. Let's add a components key here where we register the renderless tag input, and let's make sure that our path is correct here since these both live in the same folder. Let's import this component into app.view so we can play with it a little bit. So let's change renderless tag input here to just inline tag input. And let's register it down here as well. So we'll change renderless to inline, and there we go. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this renderless tag input, the inline version right here, and let's just update this title to be inline tag input, delete all this stuff, and just replace it with inline tag input, vModel equals tags, and then close that off. Okay, so if we head over to the browser, some things have changed. It's not totally working, right? And if we head over to the console, we can see property or method tags is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. So that's happening in the inline tags input. We're trying to pass tags down to renderless tag input, but we haven't actually accepted the tags, even though they're being passed to us here. So we want this wrapper component to work with vModel just like the renderless tag input does. I think it makes sense to even use the same names and stuff. So why don't we go ahead and copy the model definition and the props from the renderless tag input and paste those in here. Now we don't need both props. We don't need the remove on backspace behavior. So let's get rid of that one. And now if we save the file, we should see that the browser does update here. Let's go ahead and refresh. It looks like we have our tags, but if I go ahead and try to delete a tag, well, now we get an error. We're saying avoid mutating a prop directly since the value will be overridden whenever the component re-renders. So what's happening here? Well, the problem is we're using vModel on the renderless tag input inside the inline tag input. And like we've talked about several times, vModel just expands to a value binding and an input event listener. By default, that input event listener is going to try and mutate that value. But since the value is a prop in this case, that's not going to work. So we can get this working by just replacing vModel with an attribute binding and an event listener. Now remember, we've customized the names of that stuff in this case, so we're going to want to bind tags and listen for update. So if we bind tags, passing through our own tags, on update, we can receive the new tags and fire our own update event, passing through the new tags. So now instead of trying to mutate that prop directly, what we really want to do is just propagate that event back up one level since we've introduced a new layer here. So if we save this, refresh, with any luck, we should be able to delete these tags, add new tags, and everything is working. We can do this exact same thing with the stacked layout that we have above. Let's duplicate this inline tag input. So I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to call it stacked tag input.view. Let's grab the contents of the renderless tag input in app.view here, cut those out, paste those in here, replacing the inline stuff, and we honestly don't have to make any other changes. Everything else is going to be totally fine. So now we can head back to app.view. Right here where we're importing inline tag input, let's also import stacked tag input, and register that one as well. And now if we save this, head up to the top here, instead of making this a renderless tag input, let's just make it an instance of stacked tag input with that same vModel binding where we bind through the tags, close that off, and now this just becomes a stacked tag input not a renderless tag input. If we go ahead and refresh, we don't have any errors. Everything looks the same. I can add new tags. I can remove tags, but you'll see that if I hit backspace, we are deleting the last tag again. So let's make sure that this stacked tag input sort of bakes in that opinion about how backspace is supposed to work. If we head up to where we're defining the renderless tag input here, let's just pass through that prop where we say remove on backspace equals false. Now if we head back to the browser and refresh, hitting backspace won't delete the last element. And if you look at app.view, well, now there's no difference between what we're doing here, here, or here, except for the fact that under the hood, both of these are implemented in terms of the renderless tag input. So right now, all of the logic for the renderless tag input is duplicated in the original tag input. But these two components are able to share all that logic while only having to define the things that make those components different, which is purely the layout and any props that need to be passed to the renderless tag input.